My son had been talking for 7 minutes when I stopped counting the lies. He needed $50,000. The reason changed 3 times. First, it was the wedding, the one I wasn't invited to. Then it was the house. Then it was something about his job. I held the phone against my ear and said nothing. Outside my office window, the oak tree I'd planted when he was born was losing its leaves. That tree went in the ground in October of 1992. Michael was 3 weeks old. I remember the hole I dug 18 inches deep, the soil still soft from a late rain, and the way my wife Carol stood on the back porch holding him, watching me work. He's 32 now. The tree is 40 feet tall. I've been in this house longer than some of my neighbors have been alive, and for 30 of those years, I thought I understood the shape of what I'd built. I was a civil engineer for 31 years, Union Pacific, then a private firm, then the city of Denver. I know how to read load-bearing structures. I know the difference between a crack that settles and a crack that spreads. It took me longer than it should have to apply that knowledge to my own family. When Michael was 19, he ran out of tuition money in the second semester of his sophomore year at Colorado State. I wrote a check for $11,000 and didn't ask him to pay it back. When he was 24, he called from San Francisco with a voice I recognized, the voice he used when something had gone wrong that he didn't want to explain fully. He needed 4 months of rent while he sorted out a job situation. I wired the money in 2 transfers. When he was 27, he and Sarah found a house in Austin they wanted to put an offer on, and the down payment was short. I moved money from the account I'd been building since Carol died. The account I'd told myself was for emergencies, and I sent him $38,000. He called it a loan. I called it what it was. Before you ask whether I expected to be paid back, I want to stop here and ask you something. Have you ever been humiliated by someone you gave everything to and found yourself wondering if they ever noticed? If your answer is yes, stay with me, because what I did next changed every single thing that came after. Sarah came from money, not old money, but new money with old manners, the kind of family that hosts dinner parties and refers to neighborhoods by their school district. Her father ran a commercial real estate firm in Houston. Her mother had the particular talent of making you feel underdressed at a backyard barbecue. I met them twice. Both times, I drove the 12-year-old Ford F-150 I used to haul materials to the community rebuild projects I still volunteer on. Both times, I watched Sarah's mother's eyes move from my truck to my boots and back again in the time it takes to shake a hand. Michael told me later that Sarah's family thought I was a little rough around the edges. I've been called worse by better people. The call came on a Thursday in March. I was at my drafting table. I still keep one, even in retirement, because there are things I think better through pencil than through screen. Michael's voice was careful in the way it gets when he's rehearsed what he wants to say. He told me Sarah's family had concerns about the wedding, concerns about optics. He used that word optics, and I remember setting my pencil down. He said the venue was formal. He said the guest list had been curated. He said Sarah's parents were covering most of the costs, and they had certain expectations about the atmosphere. Then he said it plainly. They decided it would be better if I didn't attend. 3 weeks before the wedding, I had already bought a suit. I'd had it tailored at a shop on Colfax, a dark navy, the kind I hadn't worn since Carol's funeral. I'd arranged a flight to Austin. I'd taken the week off from my volunteer work. I'd set aside $2,000 in an envelope with Michael's name on it because I wanted to hand it to him in person, the way my own father had handed me money at my wedding, folded, warm from the pocket. No occasion for a bank transfer. He kept talking after he said it. He explained. He apologized in the way people apologize when they don't actually believe they've done something wrong. The apology that asks you to do the work of forgiving so they don't have to do the work of meaning it. I let him finish. Then I said, I understand. There was a pause. I could hear him exhale a long, slow release of something he'd been holding. He said, Dad, I knew you'd get it. You've always been good about this kind of thing. I said nothing to that. He said he'd call after the honeymoon. I didn't tell him about the suit. I didn't mention the envelope. I didn't say that the $2,000 had been sitting in my desk drawer since February, that I'd written his name on it in the same handwriting I used to write on his school lunch bags when he was 7 years old. I said, I understand, and I let him believe I meant it the way he needed me to mean it. What I understood was different from what he thought I understood. I sat at my drafting table for a while after the call. The pencil was still where I'd set it, outside. The light was doing the thing it does in Denver in March, flat and gray, and not quite committed to anything. I thought about 30 years, not bitterly. More the way you look at a set of drawings after a project is finished and note where the load calculations were off. Not anger, just accounting. That night, I called Patricia. She's been my closest friend since Carol died. We worked together at the city for 11 years, and she has the kind of directness that I've always found more useful than comfort. I told her what Michael had said. She was quiet for a moment, which is not typical for Patricia. Then she said, "Robert, what are you going to do?" I told her I hadn't decided yet. She said, "Yes, you have." She knows me well enough to be right about that. I didn't know it then, not consciously, but that Thursday in March was the last time I would position myself as the person who absorbed whatever Michael needed me to absorb. I had spent 30 years making sure the foundation held. I had written checks and wired money and rearranged my life around his emergencies. I'd done it without conditions because I believed that's what a father did. What I hadn't understood, until that phone call, was that a foundation only works if the structure above it is also doing its job. You can pour the strongest concrete in the world, but if the building doesn't carry its own weight, eventually you're not supporting a structure. You're just filling a hole. I put the envelope with Michael's name on it back in the desk drawer. I left it there. I didn't cancel the flight right away. I sat with that for 2 days. Then I canceled it. I put the refund back into the account it had come from, the one I'd been building since Carol died. Then I called my attorney, a woman named Linda Marsh, who had handled my estate paperwork for 9 years, and I made an appointment. I didn't explain to anyone why I was making that appointment. I just made it. 3 days after I canceled the flight, Michael called. It was a Tuesday evening, just after 6. I was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a glass of water, looking out at the backyard. The cottonwood in the corner had dropped most of its leaves by then mid-October in Denver, the light going flat and gray by 5. I watched a single leaf come down while the phone rang. I let it ring 4 times before I answered. He said he wanted to talk. That was how he put it, talk. The word stripped of anything that might have made it feel like an apology. I said I was listening. He said he understood I might be upset about the wedding arrangements, but that I needed to understand the situation they were in. Sarah's family had certain expectations. The guest list was already complicated. There were people on both sides who didn't get along, and the venue had a firm capacity limit, and it wasn't personal. Those were his exact words. It wasn't personal. It was just logistics. Have you ever been told something that was entirely personal was just logistics? I've been in engineering long enough to know that the word logistics is what people use when they've already made a decision they don't want to defend. I didn't say that. I said, "I understand." He kept talking. He said Sarah's parents had put a significant amount into the wedding. He mentioned a number, the way people do when they want the number to explain something that numbers can't explain, and they wanted it to reflect well on the family. He said the family. And I noticed he didn't say our family. He said I should try not to make things difficult. He said it would mean a lot to Sarah if there wasn't any tension around the event. He said he hoped I could be understanding about it. I counted the seconds of silence after he finished. There were 6 of them. I said, "I understand, Michael." He seemed relieved by that. He said good, that he was glad, that he knew it was a hard ask, but that he appreciated it. He said we'd get together after, when things settled down. I said sure. We hung up. I set the phone face down on the counter and finished my water. The next morning, I drove to Linda Marsh's office on Spear Boulevard. She had been at that office for 11 years. Same third-floor suite, same dark wood desk, same framed photograph of the Arkansas River near Salida on the wall behind her. I sat across from her and told her what I wanted to do. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You're sure?" I said I was. She pulled out the relevant paperwork, and we went through it line by line. The account I had built over 22 years, the one Carol and I started the year Michael was born, added to every year, restructured after she died, had $214,000 in it at that point. I withdrew $50,000 of it that afternoon and moved it to a separate account in my name only. Not a trust, not a joint account, not anything with Michael's name attached, just mine. Linda filed the paperwork. The teller at the bank, a young man named Curtis, who had helped me with several transactions over the years, handed me the confirmation slip without comment. He could see I wasn't there to discuss it. I didn't close the original account. I didn't move everything. I just removed what I'd been setting aside specifically for Michael's future, the portion I'd earmarked in my own mind as the safety net he'd never asked for, but that I'd kept building anyway, out of habit, out of something older than habit. I moved it. That was all. The following week, I found out about the guest list. David called me my older son, who lives outside of Boulder and works for a land survey firm there. David had gotten a copy of the wedding program mailed to him, apparently, with a note from Michael asking him to look it over. David called me because he'd noticed something. He said, "Dad, your name isn't in here." I asked him what he meant. He said the program listed immediate family members in the ceremony, parents of the groom, and the name listed was Sarah's parents, and then a blank line where mine should have been. He said it might be a printing error. His voice suggested he didn't think it was a printing error. I asked him to read me the exact line. He did. It said, "Parents of the groom, Harold and Diane Whitfield, Sarah's parents," and then below that, in the same font, "and family." 2 words, "and family." David said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I told him not to be. I told him it was useful information, and I appreciated him calling. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a while. The cottonwood outside had lost the last of its leaves by then. The yard looked different without them cleaner, maybe, or just more honest about what the season actually was. I didn't call Michael. I didn't call Sarah. I didn't write anything down in an email or a text that could be read later as anger or accusation. I went to my desk, opened the drawer, looked at the envelope with Michael's name on it and the one I'd put back 3 weeks earlier, and I moved it to the filing cabinet under estate pending review. Then I closed the filing cabinet. That afternoon, I called Linda Marsh. She picked up on the second ring she always did, which was one of the reasons I had worked with her for 9 years. I told her I wanted to confirm the account separation we had filed the previous month. She pulled up the file while I waited. I heard her keyboard, then a pause. "It's clean," she said. "Fully separated, your name only, no secondary signatories. Recorded October 14th. Another pause. "Robert, do you want me to document the purpose for the estate file?" "No," I said. "The structure speaks for itself." She was quiet for a moment. Linda had a particular quality I valued. She did not ask questions she already knew the answers to. "All right," she said. "Is there anything else?" "Not today," I said. After we hung up, I sat at the desk for a moment. The filing cabinet was to my left. The envelope was inside it. The account was clean and separate and entirely mine, and Michael did not know it existed. And whatever call was coming, whenever it came, it would arrive on ground I had already prepared. I had not decided what I would say when he called. I had decided what I would not do. That was enough for now. That Friday, I booked a flight to Albuquerque. My college roommate, a man named Gene Pacheco, who had been a structural engineer with the state of New Mexico for 30 years, had been asking me to come down for a long weekend since the spring. I'd kept putting it off. I stopped putting it off. I booked the flight, texted Gene to tell him I was coming, and turned my phone to Do Not Disturb for the rest of the evening. The wedding was scheduled for the second Saturday of November. I was going to be in Albuquerque. I hadn't announced that to anyone. I hadn't made a point of it. I simply had other plans. There's a thing I learned early in my career, before the big projects, before the bridge contracts, when I was still doing residential foundations in Jefferson County. You can tell a lot about a structure by what it does when you stop reinforcing it. Some things hold. Some things show you, very quickly, exactly where the load was always being carried and by whom. I turned off my phone that night at 9 o'clock. Not in anger, Not to make a point to anyone who wasn't watching, I turned it off because I was done waiting for a call that was never going to be the right call, and I had a flight to catch in the morning. And Jean made excellent green chili, and I hadn't slept a full night in 3 weeks. I put the phone in the kitchen drawer next to the spare batteries and the takeout menus I never used. I went to bed. The wedding was on a Saturday in October. I know the date because David called me that morning not to talk about the wedding, but to tell me the aspen leaves on his drive into work had finally turned. And had I seen them yet? And wasn't it something how they all seemed to go at once? We talked for 11 minutes about aspens and about a hiking trail we'd done together in 2019, and about nothing at all. Neither of us mentioned the ceremony. When we hung up, I made a second cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table and watched the light move across the floor the way it does in October, low and particular, like it's measuring something. I had no gift to send. I'd thought about it a card, at minimum, and then I'd thought about what a card would say and what it would mean, and I'd decided that sending one would be a kindness I hadn't been asked for and hadn't earned the right to give. Michael hadn't asked me to come. He hadn't asked me to stay away either, not formally. Not with those words, but the letter had said what it said, and I had read it carefully, and I understood what was being communicated. He'd made his choice. I'd made mine. The phone stayed in the kitchen drawer until Sunday afternoon. The first call came at 6:14 in the evening, the day after the wedding. I was on the back porch with a glass of water, watching a front move in from the mountains, the kind of slow gray wall that means the temperature will drop 12 degrees by morning. The phone buzzed on the table beside me. Michael's name. I looked at it for the length of 3 rings, then let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave one. The second call came 40 minutes later. While I was washing the dinner dishes, I dried my hands. I looked at the screen. I set the phone back down. Some things you do not rush. A front moving in from the mountains doesn't rush. It arrives when it arrives. He called a third time at 9:47. I was already in bed. Reading, I heard the buzzing from the kitchen, and I did not get up. Have you ever waited for a silence to do its work? It's not comfortable. I want to be honest about that. Every instinct I had, 32 years of instinct, said, pick up the phone, say something, smooth it over, be the one who reaches. That instinct doesn't go away just because you've decided not to act on it. It sits with you. It makes itself known. I lay there and let it make itself known. And I breathed. And I did not get up. The text message came at 10:23. Dad, where were you? I kept looking for you. I thought maybe you'd just show up. Why didn't you come? I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. The next morning, there were 2 more messages. The first said, I don't understand. Are you angry? Just tell me if you're angry. The second said, Sarah's parents asked about you. I didn't know what to say. This is embarrassing. Dad, can you please just call me? That one I read standing at the kitchen counter with my first cup of coffee. Outside, the front had come through the way I'd expected, and there was a thin frost on the back fence. Michael had just told me something without meaning to, that he'd looked for me, that he'd expected me, that when his new in-laws had asked, he hadn't known what to say. The letter was in the filing cabinet. I did not need to take it out. The word inappropriate was still there, and the phrase, the kind of presents we want at our wedding, and the signature at the bottom in Michael's handwriting, the same handwriting I'd watched form letters at a kitchen table 25 years ago, when the loops were looser and the pressure lighter. He had written that letter, he had signed it, and now he was asking why I hadn't come. I washed my cup, dried it, put it back in the cabinet. That afternoon, I drove out to a job site in Aurora where an old colleague of mine, a man named Frank Delgado, who'd been in residential construction for 30 years, needed a second set of eyes on a drainage issue near a retaining wall. We spent 2 hours walking the property, and Frank showed me where the grading had been done wrong in the original build and how the water was finding the path of least resistance, the way it always does. We talked about soil composition and about a project we'd both worked on in '98 and about Frank's youngest daughter, who had just been accepted to Colorado State. Frank's wife brought out 2 bottles of water and a plate of cookies and sat with us for a few minutes on the tailgate of Frank's truck. It was a good afternoon, the kind that reminds you there are things in the world that hold their shape. On the drive home, Michael called again, the fourth time in 2 days. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment. The aspens in my neighbor's yard had gone fully gold. One of them had already started to drop. I picked up. He said, "Dad," the way he said it, not angry, not accusing. Something else entirely told me that the wedding was already receding and something new was beginning to occur to him. I waited. He said, I don't understand why you didn't come. I thought you'd be there." I said, "I understood your choice, Michael. I respected it." 4 seconds of silence. Then, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means what it says." He started to say something else. I could hear him working up to it, the way you can hear someone sorting through words before they commit, and I said, "I hope the day was everything you wanted it to be. I mean that." Then I said I needed to get inside before the temperature dropped further, and I said goodnight, and I ended the call. I sat in the car for another minute. The aspen was still dropping leaves, one at a time, each one catching the last of the light before it went. Then I went inside. The call came on a Tuesday in late October, 3 weeks and 4 days after the wedding. I know the exact count because I had marked the date on the paper calendar I keep above my desk, the one my office manager, Patricia, gave me the year I retired, a photograph of the Eisenhower Tunnel on the cover, the kind of calendar no one buys for themselves. I had marked the wedding date with a small circle, not a cross, not a star, just a circle, something to close. The phone showed Michael's name at 7:14 in the evening. I was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm, looking at a set of drainage plans a former colleague had sent me for a second opinion. I let it ring twice before I picked up. "Dad." His voice was different. Not the flat, managed tone from the parking lot call 3 weeks before. This was something compressed, like air in a line with nowhere to go. "I need to talk." "All right," I said. He didn't say anything for a moment. I heard background noise, what sounded like a door closing, then quiet. Wherever he was, he had moved to be alone. That told me something before he said another word. "Things aren't good," he said. "With Sarah. With everything." I picked up my coffee, drank what was left of it cold, and set the mug back on the plans without covering anything important. "Tell me," I said. So he did. It came out in pieces, the way things come out when someone has been holding them longer than they should have. Sarah wasn't happy. Had not been happy, he said, possibly for longer than he had known. Her parents had expectations about the apartment, about the neighborhood, about what his salary trajectory should look like by year 3 of their marriage. He had known some of this going in. He had told himself it was manageable. He had been wrong about what manageable meant to them. Have you ever watched someone describe a house they built and only now realized was on the wrong ground? That was what I heard in his voice. Not grief exactly, something more like the specific exhaustion of a person who has been holding a structure together with their own hands and has just understood that the structure was never going to stand. Her father called me last week. Michael said he wanted to talk about our finances, not ask talk, like it was already his business. He paused. I thought they liked me. Dad. I thought they chose me. I didn't say anything to that. The silence was not unkind. It was just the space where the obvious thing lived, and I was not going to be the one to hand it to him. He kept going. He talked about the apartment too expensive for what it was, chosen because Sarah had wanted the address. He talked about the wedding cost, which had run significantly over what he had budgeted, and which Sarah's family had covered in part, in a way that had created obligations he hadn't fully understood until recently. He talked about his job, which was not as stable as he had made it sound over the past year. A restructuring was coming. He wasn't sure where he landed in it. Before I tell you what he said next, let me say this. I was not unmoved. He was my son. I had taught him to ride a bike in the parking lot of a church 2 blocks from our house in Denver, early on a Sunday morning so there was no traffic. I had sat in the bleachers at his high school graduation and watched him walk across the stage in a cap that was slightly too large for his head, and I had felt the particular kind of pride that has no bottom to it. Whatever had happened between us in the last year, whatever had been said or done or withheld, none of that had changed what he was to me. But I also knew that love and rescue are not the same thing. I had taken a long time to learn that distinction. I was not going to unlearn it on a Tuesday night in October. "Dad," he said, and his voice changed again. The compressed quality left it. What replaced it was something raw, and I recognized it because I had heard it from him before when he was 9 and had broken a window with a baseball and came to tell me before I found out on my own. He had always been better at confession than apology. "I'm sorry for what I said before the wedding." Another pause. "I know you're not. I know you're not what I said you were. What I let Sarah's family say." The Eisenhower tunnel photograph looked back at me from above the desk. 2 lanes going east, 2 going west, the mountain solid on all sides, 4,100 feet of rock overhead, and the road just goes through it anyway. "I hear you," I said. "I mean it." "I know you do." He waited. I think he expected something more from me, some reciprocal opening, some movement in my direction. When it didn't come, he said, "You're not going to say anything." "I'm listening," I said. "Keep going." Another pause. Then, "Dad, I need money. I need $50,000. The marriage is falling apart, and I've got debt from the wedding and the apartment deposit. And if the restructuring goes the way I think it will, I'm going to be in a position where I can't—" He stopped. Started again. "I need $50,000 to get through this, to stabilize. I wouldn't ask if I had anywhere else to go." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up. I could hear it moving through the blue spruce at the corner of the yard, the one that had been there since before my wife and I bought the house. That tree had outlasted a lot of things. I let the silence sit for a moment, not to punish him, because what I was about to say needed to arrive without any roughness around it. I wanted it to be clean. "Michael," I said, 3 weeks ago, you told me I wasn't the kind of person who should be at your wedding. You used the phrase, 'not in the same world.' Those were your words. I wrote them down." He didn't say anything. "Now you're calling me because you need $50,000. I want to make sure I understand what's happening here. Do you see what you did? Not what Sarah's family did. Not what the restructuring is doing. What you did." The silence on his end was different from the silences before. This one had weight. I could feel him sitting in it. "I know," he said very quietly. "I don't think you do." I said, "Not fully, because if you did, you wouldn't have led with the money. You would have led with the other thing." Another long pause. Then, "What do I do?" "Call Sarah's father," I said. "He's been very involved in your finances. He called you last week to discuss them. Call him back. Tell him what you told me. He loves you. They chose you. Let them help you." The silence that followed that was the longest of the call. I heard him breathe. I heard the background quiet of wherever he had gone to be alone, and I thought about what that room probably looked like, some corner of an apartment chosen for its address, with furniture they had picked together in a city where he had gone to become something, and had become something, just not the thing he had planned. "They won't," he said finally. The 2 words were flat and certain, the way a person speaks when they have already tested a door and know it doesn't open. "Then you'll need to find another way," I said. "Dad, I'm not saying this to hurt you, and I meant it. I'm saying it because you're 32 years old and you are capable of more than you think. But I am not the solution to a problem that started with you deciding I wasn't worth including." He didn't argue. That was the thing I noticed most. He didn't argue. The old Michael, the one from a year ago, would have pushed back, would have found a way to reframe it, would have explained why the circumstances made the contradiction acceptable. This Michael just sat in it. "I don't know what to do," he said. "Start with what's true," I said. "That's usually the right place." We stayed on the line for another minute without much being said. Before he hung up, he asked if we could talk again. I said yes. I said I would pick up when he called. After we ended the call, I sat at the kitchen table for a while. The drainage plans were still spread out in front of me, the coffee mug still sitting on the corner. I thought about a bridge I had designed 30 years ago, a small one, over a drainage channel outside Pueblo. Nothing significant, but I had done the load calculations myself, and I had been right about them, and the bridge was still there. I knew because I had driven past it 2 years ago on the way back from a site visit. Some things hold because you built them correctly the first time. Some things hold because you keep maintaining them. And some things you have to let them come down before you can build them right. I moved the coffee mug off the plans and went back to the drainage calculations. The wind moved through the blue spruce outside. The calendar on the wall showed the tunnel, the mountain, the road going through. I worked until 10, then turned out the light. 3 days passed. I know because I counted them not obsessively, but the way you count anything when you're waiting for something you know is coming. The way you watch a crack in a retaining wall and track whether it's moved since Tuesday. On the 4th morning, the phone rang at 7:42. I was standing at the kitchen counter with my coffee, looking out at the Rockies. The light was flat and gray, the kind of Colorado morning that can't decide whether it wants to snow. The number was Michael's. I let it ring 4 times before I picked up. Have you ever heard someone's voice change so completely that you almost don't recognize them? Not the pitch, the architecture of it. The way confidence holds a voice together, gives it structure. When that's gone, what's left sounds hollow, like a building after the load-bearing walls come out. Dad. That was all he said at first. Just that one word. But the word itself had collapsed. I said, Michael. He was quiet for a moment. I could hear him breathing shallow, rapid, the kind of breathing that comes from a chest that's been under pressure for days. I waited. I've learned that silence does more work than most people give it credit for. It creates space, and people fill space with truth when they've run out of everything else. Sarah wants a divorce, he said. I set my coffee mug down on the counter. The granite was cold under my fingertips. Outside, a magpie landed on the fence post and sat there, perfectly still. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and I meant it not for Michael's sake in the way he probably wanted me to mean it, but because divorce is a real thing, with real weight, and I've never found it satisfying to watch someone else's life break apart. Her parents won't help me. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. I thought they would. I thought they'd step in, but they told me it was between me and Sarah, and that they didn't want to get involved. I thought about Richard and Diane Kellerman, who had sat at that rehearsal dinner table and spoken about their daughter's future with the easy confidence of people who had never in their lives been on the wrong side of a financial decision. I thought about the way they had smiled when Michael explained why I wasn't invited to the wedding, how the explanation had required no defense because they already agreed with the premise. Apparently, the Kellerman's loyalty had terms. Dad, I'm sorry. Michael's voice dropped. I know I was wrong. I know what I did not letting you come to the wedding. I know that was wrong, but I'm in real trouble right now. If I don't come up with $50,000 in the next 2 weeks, I'm going to lose the house. $50,000. The same number he had called about 4 months ago, when his voice still had its structure, when he had still believed that asking me for money was a transaction he could manage from a position of strength. I didn't say anything. Dad, are you there? I'm here. I need you to help me, please. The word please landed differently than I expected, not calculated, genuinely stripped. I'll pay you back, I promise. I'll sign whatever you want. I'll put it in writing. I looked out at the mountains. The gray light was starting to break up in the west, a thin line of pale gold along the ridge. The magpie had gone. Michael, I said, tell me something. What exactly are you sorry for? Silence. Are you sorry because you barred me from your wedding, or are you sorry because right now you need me? The silence stretched out longer this time. I counted 8 seconds. I know, because I was watching the second hand on the clock above the stove, an old kitchen clock my wife had bought at a market in Taos 26 years ago. It still keeps perfect time. Both, Michael said, finally. I'm sorry for both. That's an honest answer, I said. I'll give you that. Then you'll help me. I didn't say that. Another silence. Shorter this time. He was running out of patience with his own desperation. Dad, I don't have anywhere else to go. Her parents won't help. My savings are gone. I have 2 weeks. Please. The bridge outside Pueblo was still standing. I had driven past it 2 years ago, a small span over a drainage channel, nothing significant, but the load calculations had been mine, and they had held. A structure carries what it was designed to carry, and not 1 pound more. My son, at 6 years old, had sat on the tailgate of my truck at a job site outside Colorado Springs, watching me read blueprints, asking questions I always answered. 32 years. I knew what that meant. I also knew what it didn't mean. You can't pay me back. Michael, I said. I told you, I'll sign. I don't mean financially. I kept my voice level, not cold level. There's a difference, though I'm not sure Michael could hear it right then. You told me 4 months ago that I embarrassed you, that I wasn't the kind of father you wanted at your wedding. You made that decision in front of people, and you let it stand. You can't write a check for that. He didn't answer. You chose Sarah's family, I said. You chose what they represented. That was your right. But that choice came with a cost, and the cost wasn't mine to pay. It was yours. And now you're living it. Bo. He used the Vietnamese word, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager, something that surfaced now from some older layer of himself. I made a mistake. I know I did. But I can't lose the house. I can't. Michael, I waited until he stopped. I love you. I have loved you since the day you were born, and that has not changed. It will not change. I heard him exhale. But I can't keep saving you. That's not love, or it's not the right kind. I should have understood that a long time ago. Every time I stepped in and smoothed things over, I was telling you that you didn't have to live with your own choices. I was wrong to do that. I'm not going to keep doing it. So you're just going to let me lose everything? No, I said. I'm going to let you figure out what to do next. Those are different things. He was quiet for a long time. I could hear traffic somewhere on his end. He was outside or near a window. San Francisco traffic. Probably. The particular white noise of a city that keeps moving, whether you're ready or not. I don't know how to do that, he said. I know, I said, but you will. I told him I'd talk to him soon. Then I ended the call. He called back 11 minutes later. I watched the phone light up on the counter. Then again, 4 minutes after that. Then once more, 40 minutes later. I didn't answer any of them. Not because I was punishing him, or not only that, but because there are moments when the most useful thing a father can do is not be available. When the silence you offer is the only thing that forces the other person to stand in the room alone with what they've built. My neighbor Patricia called that evening. She'd been asking about the situation for weeks, the way a good friend does carefully, without pushing. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment, then said, Robert, do you think he understood what you were saying? I thought about the way Michael had said, Bo, the old word, surfacing from somewhere underneath all the years of distance. I think he's starting to, I said. Patricia didn't say anything else for a moment. Then, good. I made dinner. The mountains had gone dark by then, just the silhouette of them against a sky that had finally cleared to black. The stars were out, the way they get in Denver in early winter, sharp and close and indifferent to everything happening below them. I ate at the kitchen table, alone, the way I had eaten most nights for the past 3 years. The phone didn't ring again that night. 3 weeks later, David called me from Austin. Not Michael David, my older son, who had watched the whole wedding situation from a distance and said very little, the way David always did. He was 41, worked in landscape architecture outside the city, and had inherited his mother's habit of calling when he had something specific to say. Dad, he said, I think you should know what's happening. I set down the pencil I'd been using to mark up an old site, drawing a habit from 30 years of field work, reviewing old projects the way some men read novels. Tell me, I said. Sarah filed for divorce. 2 weeks ago, her family's lawyers sent Michael the papers at his office. David paused. He didn't tell you. He hadn't. The last call from Michael had been the one I'd told Patricia about, the one where he said, "Bo." And I told him I couldn't give him the money. 3 weeks of silence after that. "No," I said. "Her family is going after him for everything," David said. "Attorney fees, the wedding costs, the deposit on the house they were going to buy. Apparently that was her family's money, and they want it back. Michael doesn't have it. Dad, he spent what he had on the engagement ring and the down payment on his car. He's leveraged." I looked at the site drawing in front of me. A bridge overpass I'd designed in 2003, the support columns spaced at intervals I could still recite from memory. The math had been clean. The ground conditions had been what we expected. "Where is he staying?" I asked. "He's in a sublet in the Richmond district. 1 room. He found it on Craigslist." A pause. "He's embarrassed, Dad. He hasn't called me either. I found out from his friend Marcus, who called me because he didn't know what else to do." There was one more thing. David told me something he'd heard from Marcus secondhand about a meeting that had taken place the week before. I didn't have all of it then. I got the rest later, from Michael himself, on one of the Sunday calls. The meeting had been at the offices of Kellerman's Attorney, a firm in the Galleria district of Houston, the kind with a lobby that announces what things cost before anyone opens their mouth. Michael had driven down from Austin at Richard Kellerman's request. He had not brought his own attorney. That was the first mistake, and he knew it the moment he walked in. Richard was already seated when Michael arrived. Diane was not there. The attorney, a man named Garrett Foss, who had represented the Kellerman family for 12 years, according to the nameplate on the credenza, sat at the head of the table with a folder open in front of him. He did not stand when Michael entered. "Sit down." "Michael," Richard said, not unkindly, "the way you speak to someone whose position in the room has already been decided." Michael sat. Fosse opened with the settlement figures. The wedding costs $240,000, itemized. The deposit on the house in the Highlands, $62,000, which the Kellermans had contributed as a gift, now reclassified in the paperwork as a loan. Attorney fees. A number at the bottom of the page that Michael had not been expecting. "This is what we're asking for," Foss said, "given the circumstances." Michael looked at the number. Then he looked at Richard. "You told me at the rehearsal dinner that the wedding was a gift," he said. "You used that word." Richard's expression didn't change. "Circumstances change," he said. "I have a witness," Michael said. "Marcus was there. He heard you say it." Foss made a small note on the pad in front of him. "A co-worker," he said. "Not a family member, not an attorney. I don't think that's going to carry the weight you're hoping for." Michael was quiet for a moment. The room had a window that looked out over the parking structure. He told me later that he'd focused on a particular beam of light coming through the glass, the way you focus on something fixed when you need to stay level. Then he said, "My father told me something once. He said the word logistics is what people use when they've already made a decision they don't want to defend." He paused. "I think circumstances is the same kind of word." Fosse looked up from his notepad. Richard set his hands flat on the table. "Michael," he said, and his voice had changed, the pleasantness gone, the thing underneath it showing. "You came into this family with nothing. We gave you every advantage, and you couldn't hold it together." "I know," Michael said. "I couldn't, but that's not what this document says happened." He stood up. He told Foss he would have his own attorney contact the firm by end of week. Then he picked up his copy of the settlement figures, folded it once along the center, and put it in his jacket pocket. Richard said, "You're making a mistake." Michael said, "I've made a few. I'm getting better at recognizing them." He walked out through the lobby, past the receptionist, a woman named Cora, who had been at that desk for 14 years and who, Michael told me, watched him leave with the particular expression of someone who has seen this scene before and knows how it ends. He called his own attorney from the parking garage. When Michael told me this, 3 Sundays later, I set down my pencil and looked at the Eisenhower Tunnel photograph above the desk for a moment. Then I said, "You stood up in that room." "I did," he said. "Good," I said. "That's where it starts." Have you ever watched something you built develop a crack you saw coming but couldn't stop? Not because you didn't know the engineering, because the ground shifted underneath it, and no calculation accounts for every variable. That's a particular kind of quiet. I thanked David. We talked for another few minutes about his work, about the weather in Denver, about nothing in particular. When we hung up, I sat with the drawing a while longer. Then I called Patricia. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what David had told me. She listened without interrupting. She was good at that. The way people are who have spent decades in project management, where listening is the job. When I finished, she said, "He's in a one-room sublet." "Yes." "The same son who told you there wasn't room at the table." "The same one." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" "Wait," I said. "He knows my number." The call I was waiting for didn't come from Michael directly. It came from Marcus, the same friend who'd called David. Marcus was 29, worked on Michael's team at the tech company, and had the particular discomfort of a young man who has witnessed something he doesn't know how to categorize. He called on a Thursday evening. He introduced himself, apologized for calling out of nowhere, and then said, "Mr. Calloway, I don't know if Michael has talked to you, but things are pretty bad here. He's been coming in late. He missed a deadline last week. His manager pulled him in for a conversation." I asked Marcus how he'd gotten my number. "Michael had it written on a note card in his desk drawer," Marcus said. "Old school. I found it when I was looking for a charger." He paused. "I hope that's okay." A note card in his desk drawer. Michael had been carrying my number with him to every office, every move, every new city, written by hand, the way we used to do before phones stored everything. "It's okay," I said. "Tell me what you know." Marcus told me. The deadlines, the manager, the way Michael had started eating lunch alone at his desk instead of with the team. One afternoon, Marcus had sat down next to him and asked if he was all right. Michael had said yes. Then, after a few minutes, he'd said, "I'm dealing with some family stuff." "Hold on," I said. "Tell me exactly what happened, what you saw." Marcus was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Okay, so it was a Wednesday." He was at his desk again. He'd been skipping the lunchroom for about 2 weeks by then. I grabbed my food and just sat down next to him. Didn't ask. He looked up and then looked back at his screen. I said nothing. I heard Marcus shift in his chair. We sat there for a few minutes, Marcus said. Then I just asked him straight, "Mike, are you all right?" He said yeah. But then he kind of stopped typing and stared at the screen for a second and said, "Actually, no. I'm dealing with some family stuff." "What did you say?" I said, "Is there anyone you can call family or dad?" Marcus paused. He looked at me. Marcus said, "I don't know how to describe it exactly. Like something moved across his face that he wasn't expecting." Then he said, "I already called him. He said no." "And you asked why?" I said. "Yeah," I said. "Why wouldn't your dad help you?" I wasn't trying to, I just didn't understand. Another pause, longer this time. He didn't answer right away. Marcus said. He picked up his fork and set it back down. Then he said very quiet, like he wasn't sure he wanted to say it out loud, because I told him he wasn't good enough to come to my wedding. The kitchen was very still. I could hear the blue spruce outside moving in a small wind. I didn't know what to say. Marcus said. I just put my hand on his shoulder for a second. Then I went back to my desk, but I kept thinking about it. "That's why I called you." "I just thought you should know," Marcus said to me, "in case you didn't." I thanked him. I told him he'd done the right thing calling. After we hung up, I walked to the kitchen window and stood looking out at the street below the familiar grid of it, the way Denver looks in late afternoon when the light goes flat and the mountains are just shapes. The note card in the drawer. 32 years old, and he still had my number written by hand. Michael called on a Sunday morning, just after 8. I was on my second cup of coffee, reading through a city planning document. A former colleague had sent me old habits, the way engineers keep reading specifications long after anyone expects them to. I picked up. Bo. His voice was different from the last call, quieter, the kind of quiet that comes after something has been worn down to its actual surface. Michael. He didn't say anything for a moment. I heard traffic in the background, San Francisco street noise, a Sunday morning, wherever his one room was. I know you talked to Marcus, he said. I did. I'm not calling about the money, he said. I'm not calling to ask again. Another pause. I'm calling because I need to say something, and I don't know if you'll want to hear it. I'm listening, I said. What he said next came slowly, the way things come when someone has been rehearsing them and is still not sure they'll come out right. He said he knew he had been wrong. He said he knew that what he'd done the wedding, the way he'd framed it, the phone call asking for $50,000 as though the two things existed in separate rooms, was something he hadn't let himself look at directly until Marcus had said the words out loud at that table. Why wouldn't your dad help you? He said, I told myself it was about the money, that you were holding something over me. But that wasn't it, was it? It wasn't a question. No, I said. You weren't punishing me, he said. You were telling me something. What was I telling you? A long pause, the traffic in the background, a door somewhere. That I couldn't keep treating you like you didn't matter and then call you when I needed something. That those two things couldn't both be true at the same time. His voice went unsteady. That you weren't refusing because you didn't love me. You were refusing because you did. I set down my coffee cup. The morning light in the kitchen was the particular white of early winter in Denver, thin and clear and without warmth. I had stood in that kitchen for 11 years. My wife had stood in it before me. I said, you finally understand. He cried then. Not loudly. Michael had never been loud, even as a child. Quietly, the way people cry when they've been holding something for a long time and the holding is done. I let him. When it passed, I said, I can't give you the $50,000. That's still true. I know. But I can help you find a better sublet. I know people in property management who work in the Bay Area. I can make some calls. I paused. And your brother mentioned your work has been suffering. If you want to talk through what's happening there, I'm available. Not to fix it, to listen. That's not the same as money, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, the way someone states a fact they're still adjusting to. No, I said, it's not. Money runs out. The other thing doesn't. He was quiet for a moment. Then Bo. Yes. I'm sorry about the wedding. The kitchen was very still. Outside, a car passed. The mountains were there. Behind the houses, I couldn't see them from where I was standing. But I knew they were there. They had been there every morning of my life in this city. I know you are, I said. We talked for another 20 minutes. Practical things, his lease end date, the name of a property manager I'd worked with on a mixed-use project in the Mission District years ago, whether he'd eaten that morning. He had a gas station burrito, which made me think of the years when he was 16 and would eat anything that was available and never notice the quality. When we hung up, I stood at the window for a while. The note card in the drawer, my number, written by hand, carried from city to city through all the years he'd been telling himself he didn't need me. I finished my coffee. Then I found the contact information for the property manager in San Francisco and wrote it down on a piece of paper, the way I always have, and set it by the phone for when I would call Monday morning. Michael called again on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the gas station burrito conversation. It was 7 in the evening, which meant it was 6 in Denver, and I was at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of tea that had gone cold while I was working through some numbers. He didn't ask for money this time. He said he'd been thinking about what I told him, that I wasn't going to write a check, but that I was still his father, and he wanted to know if we could talk. Not about money, just talk. I said yes. We started meeting every Sunday. Not in person, he was still in San Francisco, staying in a sublet in the outer Sunset that cost him $1,100 a month. which was cheap by that city's standards, and still more than he could comfortably afford on the consulting work he'd picked up. We talked on video, and I would sit at this same kitchen table with a notepad, and he would sit at a folding table near a window with a view of a gray building across the street. The view didn't matter. What mattered was that he showed up. The first Sunday, I asked him to walk me through his monthly numbers. Not his feelings about the numbers, the actual numbers. Income, fixed expenses, variable expenses, what he owed and to whom, and at what interest rate. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said no one had ever asked him that before, not even Sarah's family, who had opinions about everything else. I told him that was part of the problem. He wrote things down while we talked. The way I used to watch him do homework at this same kitchen table 20-some years ago, when the light was better and the house was louder. Patricia had asked me a few weeks earlier whether I was going to help him financially eventually. We were having lunch at the diner on Colfax, the one with the cracked vinyl booths that she pretends to hate but keeps suggesting. I told her I already was. She looked at me over her coffee cup. I said the help just didn't look like money. She thought about that for a moment and then said, "That's harder." I told her I knew. By the third Sunday, Michael had a spreadsheet. He'd built it himself. It wasn't sophisticated. He was an engineer by training, not a financial analyst, but it was honest. And honest was what we needed. He'd identified 2 places where his spending had been shaped entirely by what Sarah's family expected rather than what he could afford, and seeing it laid out in columns seemed to land differently than hearing it described. He said, "I didn't realize how much I'd been performing." I didn't say anything to that. Some things don't need a response. In the 6th week, he told me he'd applied for a position at a mid-sized infrastructure software company in Austin. Not the prestige of his previous role, but solid work, and the cost of living would give him room to breathe. He said he wasn't sure he was qualified. I looked at his resume, which he'd emailed me the night before, and I told him he was underselling himself on the project management section. We spent 40 minutes on language. He got a first interview the following Tuesday. After the interview, he called instead of waiting for Sunday. He said it had gone well. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He said he'd been thinking about the wedding, not the wedding itself, but the decision and how far back the decision actually started. He said he thought he'd been trying to become someone Sarah's family would approve of, and somewhere in that process, he'd started seeing me the way they saw me. An older man from Denver who built roads and didn't wear the right things and didn't know the right people. He said, "I think I needed you to be smaller so I could feel bigger." He paused. "That's not an excuse." I told him I knew it wasn't. There was a version of this conversation I'd imagined in the months after the wedding invitation arrived without my name on it, where I had something sharp to say at this moment, something that would make him understand the full weight of it. Sitting at the kitchen table in Denver, the legal pad in front of me, I found I didn't want to say any of it. What I said was, "You're going to get through this. You're stronger than you think you are. I've watched you solve harder problems than this. I believe that." He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was different, quieter. He said, "I know you mean that." He got the Austin job 6 weeks later. He called me the night he signed the offer letter. I was already in bed, reading, and I picked up on the second ring. He said, "Dad, I got it." Just that. I told him I was glad. Then I asked what his start date was, and we talked logistics for 20 minutes. And at the end, he said goodnight, the way he used to when he was young quickly, like he was embarrassed by the warmth of it. I set the phone down and went back to my book. The legal pad was still on the nightstand from earlier in the week, with his budget numbers in the margin from Sunday's call. I looked at them for a moment, then turned the page. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in late October. Michael called me that evening from his new apartment in Austin, a 1-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building near his office, which he had described to me once as small but clean. I could hear traffic through his window when he spoke. He said the paperwork had gone through without any last complications, and that his attorney had confirmed the settlement terms were final. His voice was even. Not happy. Not devastated even. the way a man sounds when he has made a decision and lived inside it long enough that the decision no longer surprises him. I asked if he had eaten dinner. He said he'd had something from the place downstairs. I told him that was good. There was a pause, and then he said, "I keep thinking about what I said to you before the wedding." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The words had been said in front of enough people that there was no version of the story where he could claim he hadn't meant them. I had been told by more than one person that he'd used the phrase, "not the kind of family we're building." I had filed that phrase away in the same part of my memory where I keep load calculations and soil reports, not to use against him, but because accurate data matters. I said, "I know you do." He said, "I don't know how to," and then he stopped. I waited. The traffic through his window came and went. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad." 3 words. He'd said them before, in various forms, over the previous months. But this version was different. This one had no request attached to it, no ask following the apology, no pivot toward what he needed next. Just the 3 words. And then silence, and then the sound of him breathing. I told him I heard him. I told him it mattered. Then I asked about his start date for the new project cycle, and we talked about that for a while. And by the time we hung up, it was past 9 o'clock, and the Denver sky outside my window had gone completely dark. Patricia called the next morning. She had a habit of calling on Friday mornings. We'd worked together for 11 years before I retired, and the Friday call had survived the retirement by 4 years now. She asked how I was. I told her about Michael's call the night before, the same way I'd been telling her things for the better part of 2 decades, without drama, just the facts in order. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So you got him back?" I thought about that. The coffee was still hot. I was standing at the kitchen window, looking at the yard, where the 2 spruce trees I'd planted the year Michael was born had grown taller than the roofline. 32 years of growth, right there in the ground, doing exactly what trees do, whether anyone is watching or not. I said, "I think I got the real one back." She understood what I meant. She said, "That's the one worth having." Sarah's family had closed ranks the way families like theirs tend to do, quietly, efficiently, and without any acknowledgement that the closing was happening. Her father had stopped returning Michael's calls sometime in the 3rd week after the separation. Her mother had sent a single text message, which Michael had read to me verbatim. "We wish you well." 4 words, professionally courteous and completely final. The friends they had shared as a couple had sorted themselves along the obvious line, and Michael had ended up with both of them his from before the marriage, both of them people Sarah had tolerated rather than chosen. He had told me about this without bitterness, which was the thing I noticed most. He'd said, "I think I always knew that her family only had room for people who fit a certain profile." He paused. "I just thought I fit it." He hadn't. He'd worked very hard to appear to fit it, which is a different thing entirely, and the difference had cost him 4 years and a marriage and a significant amount of money. But it had not cost him the Austin job, which he'd gotten on the strength of his own work. It had not cost him his friendship with David, who had driven down from Denver 2 weeks after the separation to help Michael move the last of his things out of the house he and Sarah had shared. David had called me afterward and said, "He's going to be okay. Dad, he's actually going to be okay." I had believed him. The house in the Highlands, the one Sarah's parents had helped them purchase, the one that had been held over Michael's head in ways both spoken and unspoken for 3 years, had been sold as part of the settlement. Michael had walked away with enough to cover his debts and establish himself in Austin without needing to borrow from anyone. He had told me this with something I can only describe as relief. Not pride, exactly relief. The relief of a man who has been carrying a weight he didn't choose and has finally set it down in a field somewhere and walked away from it. I had not given him the $50,000. I had not given him any money at all, beyond what I'd already put aside in the account I'd established when he was 7 years old, money that had always been his, that had always been waiting, and that I had never mentioned during any of the calls when he was asking for help. I had not mentioned it because it was not the point. The point was never the money. The point was whether he could learn to stand on the ground he was actually standing on, rather than the ground he wished he were standing on. He could. It turned out he could. There is a principle I learned early in my career, before I understood that it applied to more than bridge decks and retaining walls. A structure that depends entirely on external support for its integrity is not a structure, it is a dependency. You can pour concrete around it. You can brace it from every angle. You can throw money and labor at it indefinitely, and it will hold for exactly as long as the external support holds, and not one day longer. If you want something to stand on its own, you have to stop holding it up long enough to find out whether it can. I had held Michael up for a long time, longer than I should have. I had done it because I loved him, and because watching a person you love struggle is one of the hardest things a human being is asked to do. But there is a version of love that protects a person from consequences, and there is a version that trusts them enough to let the consequences arrive. The first version feels like kindness. The second version feels like abandonment, until it doesn't. I stopped rescuing him. That's when I saved him. I'm still not entirely sure those two sentences make sense together, and I am also completely sure they are true. The spruce trees are still growing. They don't require anything from me, now they haven't for years. They just need the ground under them, and the water that comes, and the time that passes. That's most of what anything needs, if you give it enough of the first thing. Before I go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it rather than answer too quickly. Have you ever said no to someone you loved and felt like saying no was a betrayal of the love itself? And have you ever looked back and understood that the no was the love, that it was the truest thing you could have offered at that moment, even if neither of you could see it then? I ask because I spent a long time believing that love meant always saying yes, always showing up with the checkbook, always absorbing the cost, always making the problem smaller so the person I loved didn't have to grow large enough to contain it. It took me longer than I care to admit to understand that none of that was love. It was fear wearing love's face. Tell me about a time you said no, or should have, or couldn't bring yourself to. Tell me about the person you were trying to protect, and whether the protection served them or only served your need to feel necessary. Tell me what you know now that you didn't know then, because every story told out loud is proof that we are not alone in the work of learning how to love correctly, and that work, I have found, does not end. It just gets quieter, and the quiet, eventually, is its own kind of answer. If you've ever stood at the edge of something you built with your whole life, a house, a relationship, a way of being a father, and felt the ground shift under you, and chosen to hold still anyway, you already understand what this story was really about. Not the money, not the documents, the holding still, and what it cost, and what it finally returned. I'll keep telling these stories as long as they find something true in you. I'll be here.